Okay, welcome to Rock Docs, a podcast about music documentaries. I'm David Lizerbram here with my co-host,
Andrew Keatts.
and we are at Rock Docs Pod on Twitter for people who want to talk about Rock Docs. And let's see, today we're going to talk about the film Elvis Presley, The Searcher, from 2018, directed by Thom Zimny. We kind of time this because we're savvy marketers
Yeah.
to be like a month or 6 weeks after the Elvis movie came out in the theaters, but before it's available streaming anywhere. So therefore, sort of right in between that, right now there's that gap in Elvis content
in
that the
in Elvis relevance, and
yeah.
and that's where we strike. We strike exactly then.
See, I thought it was when there was a demand, right? Like
Yeah.
you can't go see the movie in the theaters anymore because it's all Thor and Mission Impossible, but it's not streaming. So what are you going to do? You got to come here.
Yeah, for another band that might actually hold up, but for Elvis, somebody who's so defined by obsessive fans, the last thing they're going to want to do when there's a lull in their Elvis content is to hear two people who don't know that much about Elvis talk about Elvis.
I kind of know a lot about all this, some,
Do you? Okay. All
don't
right,
don't
good.
pin that on me.
All right, sorry. I didn't know you.
uh,
I'm excited then. I did not
there's a
know
lot
that.
to be revealed.
Okay,
Lots.
great.
I've done some journalism.
All right,
I've
fantastic.
really done a lot for this episode, more than the almost none that I've done for every previous episode. So, yeah. Yeah, so we will get into that film then. Let's jump into it.
Great.
Elvis Presley, The Searcher. It's on HBO. This is one of your HBO quality productions, wouldn't you say? Just off the bat looking at it.
Yeah, it's clean. It's beautiful. It's actually it's a pretty crisp, stunning movie. And it's in the not the Music Box imprint of HBO. It's their other. Yeah, I mean, granted, this was created before that imprint came out last year, but this is in their whatever their generalized HBO Prestige imprint.
Yeah. The things I
Two
noticed right off the bat.
two
Sorry,
parts.
go ahead.
Two parts. I
Yeah,
was
it's
just
a
gonna say two
two-parter.
two parts, about an hour and a half each, give or take.
Yeah. So so it's a good chunk.
Mm-hmm.
But Elvis, there's a lot to say about him.
Mm-hmm.
Um
Mm-hmm.
I a few things I noticed, you know, right off the bat here. First of all,
Mm-hmm.
it's directed by Thom Zimny, who also has directed like every Bruce Springsteen related piece of film that's come out
Yeah.
in the last like 20 years, I think.
Yeah.
Like the Springsteen on Broadway thing on Netflix. He directed that, the various music videos and um
Like the
kind
making
of
of
look,
Darkness on the Edge of Town.
yeah, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
He edited 3 seasons of The Wire, um a show
So
with which I believe you're familiar, being from
yeah.
Baltimore. It's literally about you.
Right. Yeah. So he's got roots at HBO. That says that's what we know how that relationship started, right?
Yeah. He also, it said, I saw on his IMDb page that he directed a Fish video for
Oh, really?
If or It or Is. So
Oh,
is it
I've
just ringing a
seen
bell?
that. I've watched it. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
Is it just a
They
music video or what is it?
So it was a one of their 3-day festivals that they did, and they did like a documentary of for the festival. It struck me it's pretty low production level, but they do interview all the band members. They talk about different uh, performances from the weekend. It's the type of thing that I would have imagined was like packaged on like a DVD for the festival.
Okay.
But it's on YouTube. I watched it. I don't know, 8 or 10 times during the pandemic.
Okay. So you're
Yeah.
you're really deep
12
into the
times.
Zimny stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah.
I'm mad because that was early 2000s, I think.
Yes.
So I'm
Yeah. So it was I believe 2003,
okay.
summer of
So I'm
2003.
imagining that's right before he started working for Springsteen. So I'm imagining that what happened was Bruce Springsteen, obviously a huge Fish fan.
Yeah, they've played
we
together.
just, we know that we know that to be true. They're
Yeah,
tight.
they played together.
They played together
Jersey
when?
guys.
Oh, wait, what? Is this
Yeah.
real? Is this a bit?
Yes, this is real.
Like on stage together or at the same
Uh-huh.
festival?
No, it was at Bonnaroo, I believe. Yeah. They joined the stage together. They played music together. Bruce
What did they
Springsteen on
play?
stage with Fish. Let's pull it all up. You
I
want
feel like
you want
I
to
feel
get
like
in
I'm
on
being
this?
conned. Yeah,
No,
I
you're
feel like I'm being conned.
no,
Just
no,
follow
no.
along, audience. Follow along this with me as Andy tries to incept me into his world of Fish.
Let's try to get the set list for you.
Okay.
Let's see.
Was this like Trey sitting in with the E Street Band, or was this Bruce sitting in with Fish, or some kind of super group?
No. So Springsteen had a 3 hours set the night before at Bonnaroo,
Okay, what year is this?
2009.
Okay, okay. This is blowing my whole theory up, but go ahead.
And so they Fish the next night was headlining the Sunday evening, and as is typically the case when they are headlining a festival, they do a full two set Fish show. You
Hmm.
get no shortened festival set for them. And so in the first set, Springsteen came on stage with Fish, played Mustang Sally, and then Bobby Jean and Glory Days.
Okay, so my theory might be right, but in reverse, because my
Okay.
theory was Bruce in early 2000s, being a hardcore Fish head,
Yeah.
just was sitting around with Patty watching this video,
Mm-hmm.
this Fish video. Was like,
It,
get me
yeah.
that guy. I need a director. He's my guy. But maybe it was the reverse. Maybe maybe
Maybe this was the connection.
yeah.
Fish had worked with him. He was already working with Bruce, and they were like, "Can you
Maybe,
make this happen for us?"
yeah, maybe Bruce Springsteen's booked at Bonnaroo 2009.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's Saturday.
Yeah.
Just for fun, he asks like, "Who's headlining Sunday?" And they go
Yeah.
Fish, and he goes like, "Come on." He's like, "No." They're like, "No, really." He's like, "I got to see this with my own two eyes." And the guy's like, "Well, I happen to know them. I directed one of their videos. I didn't tell you about that when I got the gig with Springsteen Inc. because you would have shown me the door." But and yeah, maybe that's the connection. I don't know.
Yeah. Two
Anyway,
Jersey guys, maybe
could be.
maybe New Jersey's finest, right there.
I believe they're from Vermont, but you wouldn't know that.
Trey is from Princeton, New Jersey.
I'm pretty sure they're from Vermont. Okay, so okay, this film, Elvis the Searcher, was produced by John Landau, who's like been Bruce Springsteen's producing partner and second right hand man or whatever for 50 years. Did you catch who did the like music? So there's like obviously Elvis music in the movie, but then there's also like kind of transitional music, like playing in the background. Did you catch who did that?
I did not catch who did that.
Okay, this is another big name who, to my knowledge, has never done anything like this before or since. Mike McCready,
really
lead guitar player for Pearl Jam.
Yeah, fascinating. So we must assume that McCready's an Elvis head.
I mean, gotta be right.
It's funny because McCready, especially, if you look at the early Pearl Jam stuff, he looks like the glam rock guy, or just
he's like the Stevie Ray Vaughan type, more like the Stevie Ray Vaughan type.
That's certainly his guitar style. But if you like, he did not look like he did not fit the grunge style at the time.
Yeah.
He looked like he might as well have been in a metal band from LA.
Yes. Okay. So you got McCready, and then did you catch? I don't know why. I'll just
Mike
say
McCready. That's fascinating. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So just notice that, audience, if you're watching or rewatching this movie, you get this like little kind of like background guitar music, during the narration parts when they're not actually playing Elvis songs. That's the guy who's soloing all over Better Man. Okay. Then the writer of this film is Alan Light, who I recognize the name because he's like a big Rolling Stone guy. I guess who's also the editor-in-chief of Vibe, Spin, and Tracks, like different music magazines. He also wrote a book about the song Hallelujah, the Leonard Cohen / Jeff Buckley / whoever, everybody song. And there's now a movie out about Hallelujah, which I keep seeing good things about, and I sort of interacted with those folks online, the people behind that movie, and they seem very nice. So, but meaning to check that out. It's, I believe, in theaters as we're recording this. I don't think it's available where we are, in the hinterlands of San Diego, but I definitely want to check that out when it comes out. It looks good.
Yeah, great.
So that's
okay.
So there's all these connections here. So this is like a high quality, high class production all the way. You got top guys, and all guys, mostly all guys. And then really, who would you say is almost, if not the first, then maybe the first notable voice you hear in this movie?
Tom Petty.
Tom Petty, all over this movie.
All over this movie, right away, right away. His first quote, it might not actually be his first quote, but not only is he all over the place, he's great. He's fantastic. He has uh, a, a lot of insights. I knew he liked Elvis a lot, and I knew that meeting Elvis was sort of a formative moment in his musical upbringing. He talks about that in the Tom Petty documentary that we already saw. But I did not know that he was basically like a Tom Petty, or excuse me, an Elvis historian. I mean, he's discussing details in Elvis's life and the impact they had on him in the way that a biographer would. It's remarkable how much Tom Petty knows about Elvis.
Yeah, it's really incredible. Like, I don't
Yeah,
think I've heard something comparable to this from like a really superstar, well-known musician
yeah,
in any other rock doc. I mean, he. If I didn't know who Tom Petty was, like the guy who did all these songs and did all this other stuff, and I just watched this movie, and I didn't recognize his voice or didn't catch the name, or whatever,
right.
because we should say that in this movie, one thing about this movie, there are a lot of talking heads, like meaning a lot of people speaking, but you don't
There are
see
no
any of
talking
them.
heads, none
Right?
talking heads.
There's just
Yeah,
voices,
yeah, they're
talking voices.
narrators. Yeah,
There's a
they're all
lot of
narrators.
people speak in the movie. Everybody from Tom Petty to Priscilla Presley to various people that work with Elvis to music writers to Bruce Springsteen himself. But you never they never cut to to a video of an interview. Like it's all over footage of Elvis or other types of footage. So
Yeah,
yeah, but if I
that's
didn't
the
know, if I didn't catch that was Tom Petty, I would just think this was like some obsessive music writer who had written 17 books about Elvis and like had spent his entire life digging in the Elvis archive for every last detail, because he just seems to know everything and also has insightful things to say about every single thing.
Yeah,
Incredible.
exactly. Yeah. He also over the credits, there's a him covering "For the Heart,"
Hmm.
Elvis song. Um, yeah, I mean, there's a middle stretch of this movie where Petty, especially, but it's like the final portion of the first part, part one of this, the first hour and a half film, where it's basically just Bruce Springsteen, Tom Petty, and Robbie Robertson
Yeah.
acting as tour guides through Elvis's career. And it's propulsive and insightful, and you can sort of just hear their reverence come through. It's, to me, easily the highlight of the movie is that stretch. I mean, those three guys are featured a lot throughout the whole movie, and there's other people who have lots of insightful things to say. But there's one stretch where all three of them are basically just taking turns telling you specifically what was going on with Elvis for some lengthy stretch, putting his music into context, and it works so well. It works so well, especially, and I think it's especially because there's no cutaways to interviews. It's all just narration over actual images of Elvis and footage of Elvis.
Yeah. I mean, we've had our difficulties with Robbie Robertson
Yeah. Yes.
in the past. Robbie,
Uh-huh.
feel free to come on the podcast and defend yourself. um, and one of his compositions that often pops up in rock docs also shows up in this movie. We'll talk about it a little
Yes.
later. um,
Yes.
but yeah, he's great. He's good in this, and Bruce is good. Tom just, I mean, crushes it. And just to kind of set the scene here, this is a two-part uh, documentary that is really, I mean, it's a birth to death type of documentary. It's not just focusing on one thing. It's that kind of format, telling the whole life story. But it does have this kind of focus in a couple ways. One is the kind of concept of the searcher, like that's in the title.
Mhm.
Um, so it's not just like it's not just trying to sort of tell the story of Elvis, in a totally neutral way. It's actually taking a point of view, which I like, and trying to
Mhm.
explain um, what drove him and kind of put a frame around his work, which I thought was kind of interesting. I mean, we could talk about how whether that succeeds or fails or how it goes, but that's kind of one aspect to it. And the other kind of framing device, which is, I should just say that, so 3 years before this movie came out, there was a similar movie, Sinatra, All or Nothing at All, which I'd like to talk about at some point, like do an episode on. But it's an HBO 2-part documentary, very similar about like perhaps the other towering mid-century musical icon of America. And it's framed around this retirement concert that was filmed that Frank did in like 1972 or something like that. And everything kind of keeps going. It kind of starts with that and ends with that, and like kind of keeps going back and forth. And it tells his life story through the framing of this concert. And so it kind of seems like there's a little bit of an echo of that here, because this
Hmm.
movie is very much framed from the very beginning all the way to the very end around the Elvis's 68 comeback special.
Yeah.
um, I actually think it probably works better in this documentary than it does in the Elvis one, but anyway, that's just kind of the framing of the documentary. So what were your kind of thoughts as you're getting into it, about those two kind of elements?
Well, so I think, yeah, uh, one one thing I think about the movie is that they do not hit you over the head with constant reminders of just how famous Elvis was, or the sort of like resetting the narrative to say, now remember, in 1961, there's no more famous person in America than Elvis Presley, or whatever year would be the appropriate reset. Um, and I think a lot of documentaries about subjects as gigantic as Elvis do that a lot, and it's to their detriment, I think, because I think as this movie shows, that's obvious. It's pretty clear. We don't need to be reminded time and again that the public's relationship with this person and this person's relationship with the world was like demented by any uh, reasonable comparison to human history. And so I like that it ends up giving the movie so much room to talk about him as an actual person. You're not constantly resetting towards him as one of the most famous humans who's ever, or most famous Americans who's ever lived. You're actually just going through like you would any other artist. You're understanding where he came from, his influences, his interests, his vulnerabilities, his anxieties, um, and sort of the logistical constraints that he was operating under. And so it ends up giving a much more intimate portrayal of him than I think it would have if they were sort of trying to again make the case that um, at the time that he broke for the first time, it was sort of like creating popular music.
Yeah, I would say that it is very much about Elvis as a musician, if it's about
Yes,
anything.
yes, yeah,
As opposed to, I mean, it's taken for granted that Elvis is like an icon, and maybe it's because this movie is made for like people probably our age or older, is like the kind of the
yeah,
target market, like people who already
yeah,
know. But even
yeah.
so, like every pretty much anybody who cares about music has like some familiarity with Elvis or image in their mind of who he is or what he looks like, or those kind of things.
To the point that those people often, or that many people often have not much of a relationship with his music at all.
Yeah, I want to ask your relationship with his music. Like, how much Elvis listening have you done, like putting on an Elvis tune or a record or whatever?
So I would say that I've sort of always had the idea in my head that there would come a time where I like got really deep on Elvis and got to the point that I like, was Elvis pilling myself, and it has never really happened. I've certainly had many moments where I've been with somebody who's playing music for me and they play, you know, something that is not an obvious Elvis tune that I like a lot. And they're like, oh, yeah, this is from X, Y, and Z semi obscure thing. And I've, you know, oh, it's like, oh, duly noted. Okay, there's a lot of good Elvis out there to get into. But I basically hadn't done it. So my relationship with him was basically limited to whatever I had happened across. But I sort of knew that there was a lot more out there that I would like, if only I could at some point get the time.
Okay. Yeah. I think I certainly have spent way more
So I,
time with Elvis than
y-
than you have.
yes, yeah. So I mean, I like in terms of deep dives I've done virtually none.
Okay.
I did one a month ago for basically the first time, and found an album that I absolutely loved and listened to it like 50 times in a week. And that was probably the deepest Elvis dive I've ever gone on.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Elvis was huge in my house growing up.
Hmm.
I mean, just the biggest deal.
Yeah.
Uh, and I I mean, I've always really liked his music. Before I really get into that, I would say I kind of feel like, growing up, maybe there was like kind of this thing of like Elvis versus the Beatles,
Yeah.
and even
Yeah.
in Pulp Fiction,
Hmm.
there's that scene. Wait, is that one of? I know it's Vincent Vega and Mia, but I don't know if it's one of the deleted scenes or it's actually in the original version of the movie. Now I can't remember if they're having a discussion about, or like, are you an Elvis person or a Beatles person? And obviously Vincent Vega's an Elvis person.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know, it kind of seemed like the kind of critical consensus over the last whatever 15, 20, whatever years just takes for granted that the answer is the Beatles. Like if you
Yeah.
care about that question at all, that unless you're like a real rockabilly like head or whatever,
Yeah.
or into something specific, that the Beatles are just, kind of won that war.
Yeah. So my dad is 8 years older than my mom. My dad's born in 44. My uh, mom was born in 52, and so he is very much an Elvis guy, and she is very much a Beatles girl, and
Mm,
it's so that dynamic certainly played out like in our house to the point of like she would tease him about like the evidence that he was old and she was not is that he preferred Elvis to the Beatles.
hmm. Interesting. Okay. So even that goes way back.
Yeah, that's been present throughout my life. Like my
Yeah.
dad used to like demonstrate that he was not cool and that he was not part of the counterculture by explaining that the formative musical moment in his life was Elvis, not the Beatles.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I mean we were huge Beatles fans, and so I mentioned that I did a little bit of actual journalism, so to
Yeah,
speak, before this podcast. So I interviewed a couple people that had some things to say about Elvis, specifically my mom and dad.
great.
um so, stop me if this is not interesting, but I have a few things to share. So first of
All
all,
right.
um I asked them about the first time they saw Elvis. So they saw Elvis. Told me about on their honeymoon in 1971. They never been like east of the East Coast. I'm sorry, west of the East Coast. And they went out to Las Vegas, and they saw him at the Hilton International, I think it was called. And my parents have been to like a lot of concerts over their lives. And this is 51 years ago. And they like immediately started talking about this concert and like remembering specifics. Now it's their honeymoon. It's like, they're seeing Elvis. It's a big deal, obviously. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, it's like, it was like it came back to them like it was yesterday. Like they were remembering specifics. He's wearing the white jumpsuit. It's the Vegas years. He's doing the karate. A couple of things they mentioned just like about the concert was that like, you know, it seemed like a long concert to them at the time. Like he was doing a lot. Like they didn't feel like they got ripped off. He was doing 2 shows a night,
Yeah.
and there was a lot of like audience interaction and like joking around with the band. Like if somebody in the band made a mistake or something like that, he would call them on it. Like they didn't remember specific quotes, but just a lot of him being present, meaning they didn't feel like he was just like running through the motions and he had to whatever sings these hit songs and then get off and cash a check. There was a lot of real engagement. Now like I'm sure that's also part of the show, like his job is to make you feel that way, but nonetheless like these people have seen a ton of concerts, and for that to be kind of pointed out I thought was pretty interesting. They didn't remember it being a real merchandising bonanza or something. It was really about the concert. And but they said he sounded great, and it was just like just an unbelievable experience to see him, even like compared to other similar superstar musicians they saw over the years.
Right.
But going back, my without getting into this in great detail, so my grandfather was in the music industry. He was involved in putting records in jukeboxes in Philadelphia, which was a huge thing in the like 50s. And they had a record store, And so, they were really involved, and the record labels would bring new musicians around to them and introduce them. Like, hey, this is a guy we just signed, Elvis Presley from Memphis. Like, we want you to meet him and see if you like his music, whatever. And I guess like Elvis, like my grandfather kind of picked up on the fact that Elvis was going to be really popular. Before, I mean, certainly he was popular in Memphis, and this was probably, I'm sure, after he'd done like the Louisiana Hayride and Grand Ole Opry and stuff like that, but like more of a regional thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess, basically in those days, the bars were de facto segregated in Philadelphia, right? So like you had, black bars and white bars, right? And they served both. And so they would put obviously different music by and large in the jukeboxes of the different bars, soul, R&B, whatever, and quote unquote music that appealed to black people in one, and music that appealed to white people. And but there's some artists that just cross over. But very early on, I guess my grandfather just saw, I'm going to put Elvis in every single jukebox in Philadelphia, and he just had a hunch that it was gonna. I mean, if a record didn't, wasn't popular, and the records that he put in a jukebox weren't successful, the bar owner wouldn't be happy, and he'd hear about it. I mean, that's his job,
Yeah.
So he didn't want to get things wrong, but nonetheless, he saw that, and it was obviously very successful. And he said that Elvis, my dad said that his parents told him that Elvis never forgot that. Whenever he came to Philadelphia, he like always remembered way after he was like incredibly famous, and like went out of his way to specifically say to my grandfather, like, thank you so much. I know that like when I was first coming up, like you put my records in every jukebox, and that really helped me go over in Philadelphia and get on the radio and all these other things, and it means so much to me, like again, above and beyond like what other comparable musicians were doing. um, there's stories that they would tell about how like they would be out in a nightclub, and Elvis would be like sitting at a table with a bunch of people. They'd bring my grandparents over to say hi to him, and like if there weren't any seats, he would jump up and insist that my grandmother sat down. Like, oh, ma'am, you got to sit. Like that
Yeah.
total Southern yes, ma'am hospitality kind of thing. Like was, he had that going all the time, and it just seemed perfectly sincere. Um, but the only other thing my dad said was he remembers when he was, I don't know, maybe he was 10, 11, 12, something like that. They moved to a nicer house in Cheltenham, a suburb of Philadelphia, and my grandfather would call it the house that Elvis built, because like he sold so many Elvis records that that was kind of the joke. So yeah, so
There
and
is
I
a
never
house that Elvis built. There's a shorter
right.
nickname for that house.
Yeah, well, that's not where they moved, but
Okay.
yeah, and I never even heard that until yesterday when I talked to my parents
Oh,
about
that's
this.
funny.
So
That's cool.
yeah, so and then my parents and I always had the dream of going to Graceland, going to Memphis.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so in I think it was summer 2000, me and my parents went to Memphis, and we went to Graceland, and it was awesome. Like I would say to anybody, if you're anywhere near Memphis or Tennessee, go to and you have any interest in music or Elvis, go to Graceland. It is really, I mean, maybe it's more run down now. I know this is 22 years ago, but it was just an awesome experience. I mean, you see his planes, you see his records, you see like the Jungle Room where they, did all that recording. I mean,
Hmm. Hmm.
you just really get a feel for like it. There's nothing else like it for music. Like,
Yeah.
there's no like, you know, opportunity to just go hang out in John Lennon's house or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, it just doesn't really exist
Yeah.
for any
Well, it's
similar icon.
like I went to Big Pink, for instance, which is
Yeah,
like a
so
big
did
deal
I.
for me. And oh yeah,
You
right, you
take a
went to, and
picture and
it's
you
like,
leave.
yeah, it's out. You're outside for the drive. Drive down the winding roads is considerably longer than the amount of time you have to see anything once you're
Right.
there. You know.
Yeah, sure. It's cool to like maybe see Abbey Road or something. Like there's things to see,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's cool.
Yeah.
But to like hang out in the room where it happened, and
Yeah.
not just a recording studio. There's a few of those out there, like Stax Records or things you can tour, Motown, whatever. But also, like where this person lived and what his
Yeah.
actual life was like. It really is. It is unique.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
shout out to that. So okay, all of which is a long way to say that I'm not new to Elvis.
All right. Great.
um, and anyway, so what else jumps out at you as we kind of roll through the sequence of the doc?
Well, so they spend a lot of time, and I'm glad they do, in um, everything that came before Elvis, and where his sounds came out of, and what types of stuff he was listening to. Right down to like being able to pinpoint almost certainly the radio station that he would have listened to. where he was
Right.
growing up. Um, and I, for one, I would say that that stretch is extremely well done. And it seems uh, specific and careful about not sort of just doing the like, well, the American music, it's a melting pot, so we there's a lot of sounds being thrown into the mix here, and he was hearing them all, and he made them something different. It's much more specific than that. It's talking about the you know gospel music he was listening to, the white gospel music he was listening to, the country music and bluegrass that he was listening to, and like in I've said this word a few times, but in precision. It's very precise and um, helps you really see what what he was what his musical education was like. And that's a stretch that's in a lot of movies. Obviously, not this particular part, but in this movie, it's done really well. And I think it also isn't tired because he's just a little bit older than a lot of the classic rock guys that all have basically the same story when this part is told. He's he's only 7 years older than Jerry Garcia. He's like 6 years older than like Paul and Mick, so he's not that much older, but it's just shifting it that back just those few years makes his influences particularly where he grew up and the the level of poverty he grew up in um makes it a bit of a fresh story. I mean, I guess it's similar to like Ike Turner's story in some ways, that we listened to last year. um but I think that stretch stands out to me as like a part of a lot of these full life rock docs that can be sort of B copy and sort of paint by numbers, that in this part feels really really good, basically.
Right. It's not like just a thing where it's like we're going to spend 5 minutes on the influences before we get to the good stuff that you're waiting for.
Yeah.
Like this
Yeah.
is very important to this documentary, and I think there's a couple reasons. I think they're trying to make this point about Elvis being a searcher, someone who's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
explaining his personality by saying he was always looking for something. He was always looking for different music, different influences, and different ways to express himself. Um, but also, I think it's because they're not sure how to phrase this. They're anticipating a complaint or problem or answering
Yeah.
a problem about appropriation,
Yeah.
and they are really going out of their way to, without explicitly address it, to show what this guy was like, and how, and how from the perspective of the filmmakers, that he was in a dialogue with all
Mm-hmm.
these different artists and all their different types of music,
Yeah.
as opposed to somebody who just like rolled in, checked out what you know black musical pioneers were doing, and said, let me take 25% of that, and then go sell that to the rich white folks.
Yeah.
um
Yeah. I
I'm
mean,
not trying to do a straw man. I'm not trying to like be unfair to anybody's point of view here, but
sure,
clearly
sure.
that's on the mind of the filmmakers.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think it's probably it's not just anticipating that argument. It's also, at least, I, I am not aware of any sort of counter argument. Maybe there is one, but I'm not even aware that that one is being made by somebody. But that it's that Elvis truly was uh, a genuine consumer of all of these sounds. He was he is a sincere and earnest uh person to have come out of this, just as anyone else. There's no like industry plant or whatever, the version of that at the time would have been about this. Although they do say that, like, the industry was very happy and had been interested already in putting a white boy on top of these sounds that that had previously been coming from black people. And the movie, doesn't sort of dance around that. They say that straightforwardly, but also that Elvis was doing was good. Everybody recognized that Elvis was good.
Right. I mean, I think the point that we're trying to make is that, yeah, you can blame all this on the industry, and
Yeah.
give them all the shots you want, but that Elvis himself, what he was doing was sincere. It was from coming
Yes.
from a real place. That
Right.
he came from pretty serious poverty, and he would, always, was around Southern Black people and spent time in the Black church, and you know cared about their music and their ways just because that's the environment that he grew up in. And he,
Mhm.
and more so even, that he, as a young poor person who had no, real reason to do this to his advantage, he crossed the color lines. Like, he went into that community, black R&B bars, black churches, just because he loved what they were doing. He
Yeah.
appreciated the music. Like, he saw it when other white people thought it was trash.
Yeah.
He was, appreciated it. And that he, that it was again, the argument of the filmmakers, this is all coming from a real place for him, even if he was used as a tool by Colonel Tom Parker and by other elements in the industry to, whitewash music that couldn't be sold to white people.
Well, what Petty says at one point, I think, about when the "That's All Right, Mama," when he records "That's All Right, Mama," and then they need a B-side for that single, and that it's Elvis's choice to record like a bluegrass song that he knew,
Right.
and
Blue
uh,
Moon in Kentucky.
"Blue Moon in Kentucky," right? And he says, it's just so perfect a distillation of who Elvis was and what his musical upbringing was, and conveying all of that to like a consumer audience so perfectly just by putting those two songs together, black blues and white bluegrass, right next to each other. That's what this guy is. But then he stops himself and says, I'm not saying that that was like calculated by Elvis. It's just who he actually was, that like the calculation was natural.
Yeah, and I mean, this was his first single on a
Yeah.
like studio that, like, nobody had ever heard of, Sun Records,
Right.
in
Right.
Memphis.
Right.
Like, maybe it was known in Memphis, but like
Yeah.
he'd never been out of that part of town. Well, like,
No.
there was no concept, there's no way anybody could have conceived that this was going to be heard,
Right.
outside of, maybe a very small regional area. Like,
Yeah, they're
maybe,
just they're
like the
describing it as like it's like a regional operation, you know? It's
right.
just like you just literally walking into department stores and being like, "Hey, I have this record now." Like to some manager, not like a talent scout, you know?
Right. It's like almost like, you take pictures with your wife at a, photo booth for a couple bucks,
Yeah.
in the mall, and then next thing
Yeah.
you know, those photos are like hanging in the Museum of Modern Art. It's like you
Right.
wouldn't think that that's going to happen. You're not going to make that, line from A to Z there, and it just kind of happened because A, the industry recognized what they had, and B, like, he obviously was just such a sincere talent and the right person in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know. Different people can look at this differently. I don't think that. I think the movie does a pretty good job with this.
Yeah,
When it first
I did
started, I
too.
was like,
Yeah.
"Oh man, are they just going to be like trying to? I don't know. Is this just going to seem like a a cultural argument or an argument against some woke point of view or whatever?
Yeah.
Not that maybe in 2018 people were using those terms as much, but but it ended up being really well handled, I think, and also it
Yeah.
really tied into the theme of like who he was, what he was trying to do. It would sound like a
Yeah.
side thing they had to address in order to then get to the main meat of the movie. This is the meat.
Yeah, which is why it works so well. It's not something that you got a studio note that's just like, hey, we have to address this here. That they're addressing it because it's natural to address it. It's it's a relevant topic at the center of it, regardless of what anyone might say.
Yeah. Kind of a related thing they mention later. I don't remember who uses this term, but they're talking about when he, we're just kind of jumping ahead.
Yeah.
But when he was on Ed Sullivan,
Hmm.
and one of the songs he played was he sang was Peace in the Valley, which is a gospel
Yeah.
song. And that, like, nobody had sang a religious or gospel type song on Ed Sullivan before. And again,
Yeah.
Elvis is just kind of coming up. Being on Ed Sullivan show is really his big national break. He'd done other TV shows. They get into that a lot, which was really interesting. But this was his big national break, and he, like, really felt strongly that one of the songs he should sing is "Peace in the Valley," a, traditional gospel song. I think it's mostly a white gospel song. I'm not really sure, if it
Yeah.
crosses over. But so this isn't about the racial thing, but it does go into the concept of, like, somebody calls him a Southern trickster figure.
Yeah.
Um, which I really like. Like he's, kind of comes out of poverty. He has these things that he wants to do and wants to express things that he cares about, whether it's religion, whether it's about R&B music, black music, blues, soul, country, all these things that he cares about that maybe the wider world, America, as he saw it, didn't know or care about, or were disregarded or considered inferior. Um, and also his religious faith, and he wanted to find ways to express those, um, through his art. How much they don't really talk about how intentional all that was, but they're definitely making the case that this is his, that he was using his success and his kind of like image, and his sexuality and all these other things to put these ideas across.
Yeah, it's very interesting point about like the idea of explicit religious music as an act of rebellion in, you know, 1950s America.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it's like we know it was a conservative time, but also it was the part of the lowercase c conservative time was that you must also be secular. And so that his moment of rebellion was to transgress that secularism. It's
Right.
it's
Or it was
very
a
clever.
type
And
of Christianity,
yeah,
right?
right.
The
Exactly. It's a
Southern
very
type, which
Protestant.
is,
It's a very
yeah,
Protestant.
it's
It's a
not the
very
WASP.
northeastern Protestant. It's a very waspy sentiment. It's like you don't talk about that. Of course, we must all be Christians, but we don't talk about it.
Yeah.
Um, and then and it sort of all goes together, I think, with his um, and the colonel sort of was apparently was very conscious of this, that he needed to be seen as a good boy. He could be a sex symbol, and he could force the issue about how sexual this music was, and how what it meant to the young people who were hearing it. But it would be a bridge too far if he was seen um, as a real bad boy. And so like the military record and all of that stuff ends up playing heavily into how the colonel had to shape him.
Would you say he's a good boy, loves his mama?
Yeah, exactly. That's I know somebody who would.
Yeah, he definitely loved his mama. Yeah, so I mean, they go through all the kind of the major hits that about, how he becomes successful, how he starts in the movies, and the first few movies are he's given the opportunity to work with real filmmakers, and he wanted to be a James Dean, Marlon Brando type. He had those
Mhm.
aspirations, which never really happened. About how he went into the army. I mean, all this was good. None of it really like jumped out at me as like super uh different from what I've seen before. The part that was interesting was when they got into his post army kind of comeback
Yeah,
time.
well, so yeah, I'm happy to jump there,
If
but
I
real
skipped over
quick, doing
something,
well. Just one little thing in that rise up, basically, pre army. There's a couple interesting things. One, they're really going out of their way not to like ever talk about what else is going on in music. We've spent a lot of time talking about the rest of American music that Elvis was absorbing, but once he breaks, there's no like interrupting to say, here's what was going on here. Here's how he fit into all of this. Um, they they
yeah,
you,
that's a good point.
they don't talk about that. And
Yeah,
later
like
on, there's
Jerry
like,
Lee
oh
Lewis,
well,
Johnny Cash, Chuck Berry, they don't appear at
Chuck
all.
Berry, Bill
Not
Haley,
mentioned.
none of that, none of that,
The
exactly.
precursors, like Ike Turner's mentioned, as a
Yes,
precursor, but
and
none of his
so
contemporaries.
offhandedly, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And which is interesting. And then Petty makes a great point, and this relates to the racial component, is that at a certain level, it was just music that rocked, and white people just had never heard anything that swung before. They had,
Right.
and black people had, and so the hysteria among white America for this, in some ways, can be boiled down as simply as giving white people the music that black people had already had for decades.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of like, yeah, oh, you guys just discovered this,
Yeah,
and but again, I mean, it's Elvis knew it all along, so
yeah, yeah.
it maybe he's one of the first white people to know about it or pay attention or care.
Also, I just got to say, I'm sorry to go on and on about Tom Petty, but if you
No, no,
haven't
no.
watched the movie yet,
Please.
I'm not overdoing it. Tom Petty is
He's all over this thing.
all over this movie. It would be hard not to talk about him. When he talks about just the sheer physical beauty of Elvis dancing, and he's like breaking it down like, you know, the way somebody would a figure in art to it's remarkable piece of commentary about how Elvis moved his body and how beautiful and artistic it was.
Yeah, and it's really interesting coming from Tom Petty because Tom Petty's a guy that's if you have a sense about the type of music that he was associated with. First of all, like he was never a guy who danced. He did
No.
lots of music videos, but they were
Yeah.
like more art pieces than dance.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he was obviously a person who wrote his own songs, and that was very important to
Mhm.
him, which Elvis never did.
Mhm.
Um, and uh, not that he's a bad looking guy, Tom Petty, but like his music and his whole thing was like, you know, in a sense, like a lot trying to be less about like looks and more about like we're real rock and roll. You know what I mean? Like they kind
Yeah.
of gave off that vibe. The band, like always looked pretty scruffy.
Yeah.
And Tom Petty never presented himself as like a sex symbol in the same way Elvis was.
Right.
So
No.
it's
Yeah.
interesting that
No
he
question.
respects and honors that, even though his career just had a different kind of vibe to it.
Also, that there's a story told during that first band when they're just playing with the slap bass, and the band members talk about having to improvise and jam and following the lead of Elvis's hips. That
Yeah,
they would actually that they actually would leave the structure of the song and know where they were going based on how he was gyrating.
yeah. There,
It's an incredible story that most bands have somebody who drives a jam if they're improvising. The drummer or lead guitarist typically, but like it was Elvis, the singer, who did it by the way he would shake his leg or swivel his hip. It's a wild way to think about leading a piece of improvisational music.
Yeah, there's a lot in this about that, and also about how he, like, in the studio, you just kinda had to, like, go with his flow and what he was doing, and it just
Yeah,
reminded me
yeah,
of Dylan, of course.
yeah, 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 yeah,
Because
yeah.
both of them live and in studio are just, like, you know, pretty soon after they started, became such towering figures and had such a
Right.
unique kind of vision and way of being that, like, anytime Elvis was involved with something, it was an Elvis joint. Like, he was never,
Yeah,
the other guy.
yeah.
And, pretty much the same with Bob Dylan. And we talked with the Joker Man at great length about Bob in the studio, just like walking in and like grabbing a guitar and expecting everybody to just follow along. And that's the the record that you hear. And Elvis, it was kind of a lot of the same stuff, especially later on, when they're telling stories about him, recording like that. It was just very much, catching that lightning in a bottle, and whatever he wanted to do got done. And you just had to be like, on your toes, waiting for him to, tell you what to do.
The other thing, but when this is not, well, maybe if we maybe I could torture it into being similar, but at first blush to me this seems different than Bob. Is they talk about him sort of killing people by saying with yeses, that
Hmm.
he would say yes to
Yesing them to death.
absolutely everything. Yeah, he would he yesed the industry people to death. Um, and it seems like in the 70s it starts to, like, well, not the 70s, in the 60s when he comes back from the war and he's got the movie run, the they're yesing him to death,
Yeah.
and he's doing stuff he's not happy with. Um, but it's an interesting idea of him being in complete control by adopting this good boy persona, always saying yes, honoring his contracts, and all of that sort of things. That strikes me as different than Dylan, but maybe I could be convinced otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, most people don't consider Dylan to be like super warm and personable the way that
Yeah,
Elvis was.
yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
yeah, they both had their way of handling this like incredible fame. And all right, so well, I guess the other thing that's kind of touchy in the movie and about his life, they don't address a lot of the controversy about Elvis in terms of like his relationships with women and all these other things. This is not the subject of the movie.
Hmm.
In terms of like, not, I don't know, think there's any accusations of Elvis ever, being inappropriate. I think that, you know, from the time he was, first started recording to like the day he died, like women were throwing themselves at him, and he never had to, make advances.
Yeah.
But there is, of course, a lot of Priscilla in this movie, and
Yes.
she has a lot of really interesting things to say. But of course, she tells a story about how they met, which was when he was in the army, so he's in his early 20s, and she's 14, and she doesn't get into details, but they're basically dating. They didn't marry till she was in her early 20s, uh 67, I think, or somewhere around there. They got married. But they were basically together from the time that she was 14. And it's like, once again, another Rock Docs theme. Rock stars and their 14-year-old girls back in the day just seem like, I mean, she seems fine with it, so it's not for me to judge her life. But it is kind of a, that's, they're perfectly happy in this movie to get in, to mix it up about his appropriation of black music, or the arguments about that. But the him being with younger women is not something they really want to address more than in
I
passing.
mean, amazingly, it might be a harder thing to talk about, in a
Yeah,
movie.
sure. Well,
So
yeah.
yeah.
I mean,
Um,
appropriating black music isn't a crime,
right, right. I
you
guess
know.
that's true.
And I mean, I was like, oh, here we go, the 14-year-old girls again. Which Jerry Lee Lewis married his 13-year-old daughter, his 13-year-old daughter, no, cousin. And it's like, that seems to have been a controversy, but Elvis being with a 14-year-old, it's like, boy, in those days, that 1 year really made a difference. I don't know, different
Yeah.
times, but boy, yeah, they really don't want to touch that, and his, philandering and all that stuff. That's just not what they're trying to talk about here. Um, but they do focus on a lot, which is, I guess, not really, something that's, I guess, as well known as like his post army comeback. So he goes in the army,
Yeah.
58, comes out about 60, right around then. And that was such a hard time for him. They talk a lot about the difficulties he had in the service. It's not like he was in a war; he was just sitting in Germany. But nonetheless, he's away from home. It's in the cold. He's not in an environment that he cares about. He's lost. His mother has just died, the most important person in his whole world. He lost touch with his career that he had going, and didn't know if he was ever going to get that back. And
They do
when
a
he
good job of explaining. This is one part where they do like center the context of the time that like it would have been completely normal at that time to assume that his fame was a blip and that would have been a
right,
passing fad.
sure,
That now you wouldn't assume that, but at the time that rock and roll was mostly dismissed as something that was likely to be a fad and not the
right.
dominant form of the next 50 years of the country's history.
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of things that were like hugely popular for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Welcome back, Cotter, or something. That
Hula
nowadays it's
hoops.
like, yeah, sure, okay, like exactly, hula hoops for the kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
That that is, we just kind of look back on amusement, or we just don't think about a whole lot now. But nobody knew at the time, of course, in 1958 when he went in, that he was going to be like the biggest. People were going to be talking about him in whatever 70 years later or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Um and yeah, so but keeping in with the theme of the movie, they're talking a lot about how when he came back, he really was very focused on the material he did, and
That
what
album,
his
Elvis
image
is
was going to
Back,
be.
is great.
Yeah, yeah,
Great
it's
album.
killer. They talk about how when he was away, he really worked on developing the operatic tenor of his voice.
Mhm.
That kind of like high, being able to hit high notes, but not in a like in a nasal voice, not in a like falsetto, which a lot of singers do, but like really hitting it with your chest. So it's that, like, those big notes at the end of the song, "It's Now or Never," really are in that Italian uh, um, musical tradition, and they kind of pay that off a little bit, which I thought was really interesting. Again, really getting into his influences in a very specific way that could have just
Mhm.
been glossed over and been like, "Hey, here's another hit song," but kind of tells a story of that song that you can't help but then listen to it in a different context. I thought that was, another piece that they really just, I was really impressed with.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And then, it sort of carries through. his return period, he falls into this stretch where he's making a lot of movies, and the records aren't happening. The soundtracks to the movies are his musical output, his primary musical output, and neither he nor anyone else thinks it's the best material he's putting out.
And
And
he does not play a live show from the date, like from when
yeah,
he goes into the army in 1958 till like 1968. Not
yeah,
one
it's
concert.
so Beatles-esque. It's such a what a
Yeah,
weird thing music was before we decided that everyone should do it exactly the same way.
yeah.
You know,
It just didn't seem to occur to them, like, hey, he's back from the army. We
just
should do a concert.
which is wild because like, he came up as like a barnstormer who was playing nothing but shows, playing
Yeah,
every night, you know?
yeah. Doing an incredible amount. Yeah, that's another thing they talk about is just the like unbelievable amount of concerts he performed. As when he was coming up, it was just like went from being a truck driver, like climbing electrical poles, not trying not to get shocked to death, and became started this music career and just went 100% like 24/7 full tilt, very
Yeah.
ambitious, and was not giving this up for anything.
Yeah,
So
it's a
good.
cool story that they um had to like rearrange the tour cuz the headliner couldn't go on after him.
Right. Yeah. One of those famous stories of like the
Yeah.
opener or somebody else just blowing the headliner off the stage. I'm trying to remember who it was because was it Hank Snow, another kind of well known performer,
Yeah.
but obviously nobody ever went on successfully followed Elvis on stage.
Yeah.
Yeah, they get
Um
through the movies, the '60s movies era. They're just dogging on it.
yeah. They're crushing those. I don't I mean I have a sense that like for some like Elvis fans, people they're kitschy, but people like those movies. That there's like nothing nice to be said about those movies here in this documentary.
Yeah, I liked them when I used to watch them when I was a kid. Like my mom and I would watch like Elvis, it would come on TV like Saturday afternoon, and so I've seen a lot of parts of a lot of those movies. Rarely was it like
Yeah.
let's sit down and watch a movie from beginning to end, but it would just kind of be on. Or like some TV, station would have like, an Elvis movie marathon on Sunday. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And like just kind of you get little bits and pieces and I always like that stuff. I think it's kind of fun and like the colors really pop a lot of times. It's not
Mhm.
like again, I'm not trying to say like, oh yeah, this is, you should forget if you're checking out '60s movies, you should forget like The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde. This is where it's at. But I think maybe there's probably people could make an argument that it has more merit than it's given credit for in the movie. But certainly Priscilla attests to the fact that Elvis hated every minute of it pretty much and
Yeah.
was just locked into this contract. And then you get an interview with him himself talking about it, which was really
Yeah.
interesting.
Priscilla also says that like during this period, Elvis didn't even talk about or listen to other music. He was completely detached from what else was going on in the world of music. Um, there's a different part, and I don't know how you reconcile these things, where they talk about that he was intrigued by what was going on with like Beach Boys and the Beatles and the Byrds or whatever. But there's
Yeah, they
one
specifically say Peter, Paul, and Mary and
Peter, Paul,
Dylan
and Mary.
because
But
Dylan was connected to the blues.
yeah, but he did not like Dylan's voice. He thought Dylan
Yeah,
was a bad singer. Yeah.
but he liked
Um,
Odetta's covers of Dylan.
Yes, right, right. But Priscilla does say at one point that during this movie he like had lost his interest in following music, and that he was kind of it sounded like he basically was given whatever he just recorded whatever he was given, more or less.
Yeah,
Um, and it's just interesting to think back, 20 years to somebody who seemed to have music so in his bones
right.
to lose track of it, you know.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of their way of saying that he lost his just lost his way in the world.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, they kind of go on. One part that doesn't really work as well for me is they have this little bit where they're talking about they're playing The Wait
yeah.
with
This
Mavis and the Stable Singers singing. Our beloved Mavis. Shout out to Mavis.
is
Um,
easily the most appeared song in the Rock Docs
not
podcast.
not even a question. There's like no number two.
It's
The Wait
crazy.
just keeps popping up.
Yeah,
But there's a little bit where they're talking about a little bit about current events in the late '60s.
yes.
They talk about how somebody says like the day MLK was shot, Elvis turned to us and said he always told the truth.
He was right. Yeah,
and
yeah.
about the night RFK was shot and what was going on there.
We
They're
need to
trying to
listen to
tie
each
Elvis.
other. Yeah.
Yeah, we need to listen to each other. Exactly. They're trying to
Yeah.
tie Elvis into the current events of that time. It's a little bit of a stretch. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I'm not. I think maybe not quite enough attention was paid to that, or I just didn't know why it was in there.
Well, it's just like, we've joked about this before the show where it's like, you know, uh, playing if you're going to San Francisco or something when the movie uh
Yeah,
transitions to its California section
California dreaming.
or California dreaming or whatever. And like playing the weight and mentioning all of the assassinations of 1968 and saying like, boy, it was a wild time in this country. Like at this point, I do know that 1968 was a wild time in this country. I got it. That
So now we get.
that I've absorbed that.
Yeah, exactly. So, and we get to the peak of the documentary, and kind of from the documentary's position, maybe truly the peak of his career, and really the peak.
Hmm.
Like it never gets better than this. Is the '68 comeback special? So just to
Hmm.
kind of set the scene, Elvis has not played a live concert in 10 years. He's made these increasingly, perceived as corny movies. He's making these. He had done some interesting stuff, like he had that comeback album. He did a gospel album that was well received, but by and large, at this point, he was like culturally, critically irrelevant. Like the Beatles and all these other artists are, Sly Stone. Everybody's out there breaking new ground, and he's making corny teeny bopper songs long after teeny boppers have cared about what Elvis was doing. Um,
Hmm.
and one way or the other, he decides to kind of come back. They don't really exactly say how it all comes together, but
They don't.
somebody somehow has decided that he's going to do a TV special, and it's going to be his comeback. And he, puts on a leather jacket and pants, and is going to be playing the guitar and singing his old songs as well as like some more contemporary stuff, and just showing everybody why he's Elvis. And boy, does he ever do that. I mean, I
Yeah.
love the '68 special. I just
Well,
love that. I love that whole era of Elvis. This is my stuff.
yeah. I mean, just knowing that there is a time where he gains weight and looks bad later in his career,
Yeah.
and you've just gone through this long period where he's unhappy, he's disconnected from music, he's making material that his fans don't think is the best, and he's not inspired by. But then you see him walk out in 1968, and he's like the most beautiful man to like live at that moment.
Right.
Like like you imagine like well he's started to slide already, but he's still the image of Elvis at that moment as much as he ever was. He's high
Yeah.
cheeked and tall and thin
Right.
and handsome.
Yeah. Hair looks great. Everything.
Hair
Yeah.
looks great. Yeah,
And
exactly.
just doing all the moves, and it totally
Yes.
works. I mean,
Yeah.
here's his big comeback, which really is the peak of his life. He's dead less than 10 years later,
Yeah.
and he's 33 years old.
33 years old at
Like
his
I
death
had
is
looked that up, and I'm
crazy.
like, come on. Like
I
like
looked that up
it's
too. I
incredible.
couldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like he's done all this stuff. He's been in the wilderness for 10 years, and he's 33. You know what I mean? Like he'd already done, he was already in the Hall of Fame like many times over at this point.
I mean, we're skipping ahead here a little bit, but like in the lead up to his death, they're basically just like, well, his body couldn't take it anymore.
Right.
He's taking uppers to get up, he's taking downers to get down, and like it just takes its toll. It's like, yeah, he's 33. Like,
Yeah, I know.
most
Exactly.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he does this concert special, and there's lots of footage of the concert special, and lots of talking about like of the all the work that put into it. Like they had like
Hmm.
writers, they had teams of songwriters and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
This wasn't just like, hey, let's do a concert special. Like, hey, what are some of your old tunes? Get the old guys back. We'll get the new band together, and it'll be fun. Like this was like a put together, like a like a major event.
Why don't we do these anymore? These
I don't
like
know.
between this and like Hey Jude we just talked about on the show a few weeks ago, and what Get Back was supposed to be. Whatever happened about we don't have television producers who are
Well, now we
capable
have.
of I mean we
Yeah,
have like streaming concerts. We
no,
have
you know what this is? This is
yeah.
like the Super Bowl halftime show,
Yeah,
kind of, in a
you're right.
way.
That's
Like
exactly what this is.
every
Yeah,
year,
you're right.
some big pop
Fair enough.
star,
We have that.
you
Yeah.
know, but it's not the same. Well, because it's like it's happening. Every year,
Yeah.
it's now like a formula. Like,
Yeah.
hey, it's J Lo, it's whoever. They're putting together a Super Bowl halftime. This is their big artistic statement. This is the crowning achievement in their career. Are they going to do this? Are they going to bring out whatever? Like we've seen it a million times now, but
Yeah.
nobody had ever done this before. Like
Right.
people had a comeback or whatever, but like there was nobody, who's like that I can think of whose career was like down and had come back in this particular public way,
Yeah.
from nothing to like boom. And Bruce Springsteen talks about how like they knew this special was coming for like weeks and there was like hype about it and he was
Mhm.
excited, he's and Bruce at this point it was 68 was already like a working musician basically,
Yeah.
and was probably he's 21, I think, at the time. So he's not a kid, sitting around watching the TV with his parents. Like, he's wherever,
Yeah.
living out on the street, out, in the Badlands or wherever he is. Um, yeah, and they all just everybody had to gather around and watch it, and just were like so blown away by him just coming back and just showing everybody what it was like. And I kind of wanted to tie this together. Tell me if this is like I'm pushing it here, but another rock doc favorite is the
Okay.
Beatles rooftop special. Does this, to me, it's like there's a kind of a little bit of a Get Back vibe there, if that makes sense. Meaning, like, okay, we've kind of gone off and done different stuff. Now we're
Oh,
like
yes.
going
Oh,
back to like
100%. Yeah.
the old school, rock and roll. They're literally playing Elvis songs in, Get Back and the Let It Be movie, whatever. And
Yeah.
it's never been mentioned, and I have no reason to back this up other than to say that Get Back, the movie Get Back, the Let It Be sessions occur in January '69.
Mhm.
This special, the
Yes.
Elvis special,
Yes.
comes out December 7th or something, 1968. So I, maybe somebody's looked into this or written about it or whatever. I'm curious whether the Beatles saw this, because I think this was an American special. Like I don't, but I gotta
Well,
imagine that
but
if you're
but
the
but
Beatles, you
Hey
could have gotten
Jude,
this.
but Get Back was sort of redoing the magic of Hey Jude, which was, how many months earlier was that, which was also a TV special, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The
No, that
sort
was
of
in the fall.
concert
That
in
was
the round.
before. Okay, so we have the Hey Jude like little,
Yeah.
live, quote unquote live performance,
Yeah.
which was on
And
TV.
then this.
That's fall '68. Then you get this. This is in December '68, and then in January '68 they gather in the studio, Twickenham Studios, and then at Apple Studios to do this kind of comeback. So yeah, it's. I'm not saying this is the reason why they did
No, it's
Get
there's
Back and Let It
the
Be.
the
I'm
TV
saying this.
executives have a they've struck on something that they like, and they're talking to the world's biggest musicians and saying, "This is a good way for us to make money and for you to make music."
Right. But also it's not just the appearing on TV. It's also
Yeah.
uh the hey, let's look back at the things that made you such a
Yeah, yeah.
popular, incredible live performer in the first place and share that with the world via TV.
Yeah.
That is
Right.
that specific element, which is such an important part of the Beatles story and leads up to
Yeah.
the rooftop concert. Um, I it just makes me curious, and I never thought about it before this. Was there anything to do? Did Elvis's '68 comeback special? Number one, was that seen or popular across the pond? Did they, and did they take notice of that? Was that part of
Mhm.
their
Mhm.
thinking when they go into the studio in January, a month later, to try to do their own, kind of comeback type of thing?
Yeah.
Speculation. That's what we're here for.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. So now, then we get into the like, kind of the later years. I don't know. What do you think about how the movie handles all that?
It's a little bit of a lull here. If there's a lull in this movie, it's this stretch after the '68 special where you sort of talk about his addiction taking over. They start trying to explain the grind of the road. How what an impact the touring schedule is having on him. He's playing about 150 shows a year, um, and it's just sort of wearing him down, and he's sort of just being hollowed out. Um, it's 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 fine. I don't have any problem with it, but it is not as um it's not as fun to to watch, and
Yeah.
maybe that's just the
Yeah.
topic, but the up until here, the movie's like kind of a romp, and this part gets pretty um gets pretty long, becomes a bit of a long sit, I think.
Yeah, I guess so. There's some stuff where I mean, he does the Elvis from Elvis in Memphis album after the 68 special where they do,
Yeah.
they talk about him doing Suspicious Minds and
Right,
some,
right.
big songs like that. So that's popular. And that, that's not quite like the end times.
Mhm,
The
mhm,
I think the problem here is that because the movie is focused on him as a musician and as a searcher, as somebody
mhm.
who's like constantly trying to like express himself as an artist and is looking into the world in different um you know types of music, genres, other ways of expression, and incorporating them into his own thing. When that is not when he's not doing that really, or when it's the light is not really on, then the movie has less to say because
Yeah,
there's plenty
yeah.
of interesting stuff to talk about in Elvis in the 70s.
Mhm.
But a lot of that is going to be outside the scope of what the movie wants to talk about, his relationships with women, or his all the wacky stuff, and him meeting Nixon, and all these crazy stories, and things that happen to him. Like every single day of his life is interesting because he's such a big star, and he so many like more crazy things happen to him like in a day than like most people in their entire lives.
Yeah. And as we said
But
before, like, this movie is not
yeah,
interested in that stuff.
yeah, and that's fine. That's a
Oh, it's
perfectly
great. I like it.
interesting
I
way to.
think it's great.
It's
Yeah.
a good take, but
Yeah.
it means that you have less to talk about for those
Yeah.
last 9 or 10 years,
Right.
while he's really
Well,
on
and
that
I
downhill
don't know if you
decline.
had this I don't know if you had this experience, but I'm watching the movie, and during the second one, I'm sitting there going, "There's only 40 minutes left in this movie, and we're only at 1968. Like, there's going to be some sort of coda at the end. Like, how much time do we have to devote to the entire 1970s, basically?
Yeah,
Um, and so we just described how they do it, but it did catch my attention. I was like, wow, there's not that much time left, and they still have a lot of his life to go through.
yeah, and they kind of zip through things. I mean, I think
Yeah,
they talk about how the Colonel famously like wouldn't let Elvis play outside of the U.S., so he came
yeah,
up with his
yeah,
idea for the worldwide simulcast Aloha from Hawaii, where a billion people are watching, and how Elvis. They have an interview with Elvis at the time where he's just talking about how hard that is to comprehend.
yeah,
Um, there's good stuff like they. I mean, the part where they're we're listening to the recording of the song separate ways,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and it's about somebody getting divorced, and at the same time he was getting divorced from Priscilla, and Priscilla's talking about it in the movie. That was really affecting.
Yeah,
Like that
I
was
agree.
like, wow, this music is heavy. you know
Yeah, yeah,
like again, this is not just, yeah, I mean, it kind of could come across as just like, all right, this is one of these like sad country songs that were popular in the 70s, these tear in your beer
hmm
songs, and he did a lot of those. And like Good Time Charlie's Got the Beat Blues, great songs like that. um which didn't they talk about that on Time Crisis? Was that the one?
Time Crisis. Yes, that was the conversation that got me down a rabbit hole, listening to the album that was
Yeah,
on repeat.
yeah,
It's incredible. It's like
yeah,
recorded in Nashville with like a 12-piece band in the studio.
right.
There's like pedal steel guitar. It's fantastic. Like, honestly, and it's like early 70s. I hate to be a cliche, to become a caricature of myself, but I couldn't help but think about like how much it was like what the Grateful Dead were doing in the
Yeah,
early
exactly.
1970s. It's
Yeah,
crazily.
if you like the country rock type stuff that the Grateful Dead was doing, that Bob Dylan was doing, that the band
Yeah,
were doing, that you name it, were doing in Linda Ronstadt, etc., in the early
yeah,
70s. If you like any of that stuff, listen to the Good Time Charlie's Got the Blues. Listen to from Elvis in Memphis, and the like
right.
that era, the late 60s, early 70s Elvis stuff. Um, is like
It's
it's
incredible. It's
incredible, and
great.
there's no like, if you like one you're gonna like the other. It's exactly that genre, and I
Yeah,
think that's the thing that is most forgotten. Like, I think if people are like now checking out Elvis, the thing they're most told to look at is like the early Sun records,
right.
which are all great, no question about it, they're awesome. But again, like, I really like this the late 60s, early 70s stuff, and that kind of country rock, it all just kind of fit into me. So they talk about that stuff. That's good. They talk about the American trilogy. This like famous, like he would um famously in concert sing this like suite or medley of patriotic songs. Um, Dixie, which now we probably wouldn't sing at all, but like, it was much more commonly heard back then. The Battle Hymn of the Republic and, Glory, Glory, Hallelujah, all that kind of stuff. And, you know, there's just no way to conceive of a rock musician, uh, you know, uh, uh, other than like a Kid Rock type of guy, but somebody who's taken
Yeah.
it remotely seriously by the critical world or people who are most music fans that are listening to this show. There's no way you're gonna get that. Like that type of thing is out the window. It's not even like it's not on the menu.
Yeah, I mean, so we're just talking about how similar he is in some ways at this point to, sort of the classic rock canon of the early '70s. But as you just described, he's there's always a healthy distance between him and that because he has this like I don't know, like show tune type sensibility. Like all the Vegas stuff and everything you're talking about here. Like it's not like a rock show. It's
Yeah,
it's like something you'd see on Broadway. It's like musical theater.
yeah. He's presenting himself as a traditional performer.
Performer, yeah, I mean, I guess Sinatra is the better comparison, but
Yeah,
yeah,
Sinatra or yeah, like the Italian, like the Perry Como type of people.
right,
The like yeah, it's he comes from an era before like being a rock star was a thing,
right,
and he never, he didn't like again by the time especially the 70s were around, he wasn't clocking what other rock stars were doing, like, or it didn't, that probably did not enter his world. Like,
right,
hey, gee, what's Led Zeppelin doing now? You know what I mean? Like, I don't like it just wasn't Led Zeppelin was doing tons of Elvis songs. Um, that was a huge influence for them. It was not going the other way. At
right,
that
right,
point,
right,
maybe country radio or something would come, gospel or something would come across. But for the most part, he was just not even probably paying attention. And the idea that like doing a suite of you know stand up and salute the flag songs would be considered corny and out of date. Like first of all, like they said, like they say about Elvis, he never once in his entire life played a concert to an unsold seat. Like
That's
every single
yeah,
concert he ever played his entire life, which is thousands of concerts, was a sellout. Now I don't know if
yeah,
that's like literally true, but it's pretty close to being literally true.
yeah,
And at that point, like if you've been doing it since you were a young man and here you are, you're still, the biggest performer in Las Vegas, the biggest place to be a performer. I mean, why would you think you're doing anything wrong or corny or
right,
who cares? Like who cares what
yeah,
some long-haired weirdo thinks?
yeah,
Um and I think is it Springsteen or Tom Petty that like kind of defends that stuff like the artistic merit of that. I think it's Tom Petty.
yeah, yeah. He says something at the beginning. He says, "This isn't what you're related to," but he says, um, "We shouldn't make the mistake of writing off a great artist for all the clatter that came later. We should dwell in all that great music he made."
Yeah.
And so there's a sort of concession, like, okay, sure, there's some stuff that's not so good, but like,
Or we just can't get
who wants
into
to
it
remember that?
now.
Or yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, maybe it's just stuff that like is just so outside of our, world what you're going to get now that it, yeah, Elvis in the '68 special when he's playing like old, our '50s rockabilly tunes. Like you could see somebody playing that. You could walk into a bar today and see somebody playing that now. That kind of stuff, and you'd be like, yeah, okay, I totally get what they're doing. It's rock and roll. You know what I mean?
yeah.
It's not that different from what somebody who has you know, billiard ball tattoos on his forearms is playing in some bar right now as we speak.
You know what just occurred to me? This movie must have come out after Tom Petty died and recorded
This came out in
in 2018,
2018,
and he died
and
in
Tom Petty
September
died.
2017,
Yeah, sure. So they probably recorded him before he died.
or just before he died. So
Um,
he's,
but not after he died.
I doubt.
I'm just
Yeah,
saying.
I doubt. But so like that's interesting to think of too, because he was apparently struggling with addiction at that point. And he talks about that a little bit about Elvis, that and
Yeah.
he's um and also it's just like you get so much of Tom Petty here, not just like by volume, but like you get such an insight into how Tom Petty sees the world just by the way he talks about who Elvis was and what he meant. It's it's a nice little it's like finding a voicemail from somebody who you love who died after that you get to listen to after they've been gone for a little while, you know?
Yeah, I wonder if that was yeah. So yeah, I mean, you're making a good point that probably they're editing the movie and putting it together when he dies,
When he dies, yeah.
and they that influenced the amount that they let him tell the story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I don't know.
I mean,
Maybe
but by all accounts, even just putting everything he says in this movie end to end could be a book about Elvis Presley. I
he
mean,
could write a book.
yeah, yeah. I mean, like it seemed Tom Petty seems to have the grasp of Elvis Presley's biography that you'd expect of a biographer.
It's a shame that he died, obviously, for many reasons, but one of them is that you think you got to think that he had this in him. Tom Petty did to talk at length about other musicians like Bob Dylan, like the Byrds, others that
Bob
were
Dylan,
yeah
yes,
influential
yeah,
to him, the Beatles. Get Tom Petty on the record. And I haven't read his book. Maybe he does some of this in his book. But you got to figure as he got older, he could have done more of these. He could have done a lot more. Maybe they would have heard him in this and said, let's get him talking, for an hour about the Beatles, about any of these people. And, so,
yeah. I mean, when his voice came in the first 3 minutes of this movie or whatever it was, I was like pumping. I think I might have actually pumped my fists in there, like because it's like I said, it's like I love Tom Petty. Okay, here we go. I'm about to get a bunch of new Tom Petty material.
yeah.
You know,
Yeah. And Bruce's insights in this are good. Sometimes Bruce can be, a talking head in a documentary and, there's like a really short clip or something, they'll just get
yeah,
him to give a quote and it might not be terribly insightful because it just might be something he said before a million times. So they're not taking the time to get some real juice out of him, but he does have some interesting insights about about this, and Robbie Robertson is good too. But yeah, again, as we've said, Tom Petty just the great. Now, getting to the end, I mean, really, you get to his recordings in the Jungle Room right before he died. He's singing a song called "Hurt." To me, he sounds like an Elvis impersonator at best. At that point, I mean, it's really rough. Um,
yeah,
and then they just basically say like Elvis died, like that little title goes on screen. They talk about his death,
yeah.
and then they get again to they go back to the '68 special to wrap it up, um, and it's sort of a
Hmm.
coda. And they talk about RFK's death. That's the point where they talk about RFK's death, um,
Yeah.
and they talk about how Elvis felt like he needed to say something. So this is kind of where the like current events thing does tie together a little bit. They talk
Yeah.
about the song "If
Yeah.
I Can Dream," and again, it's kind of the kind of thing where like his performance is great. Um, it's again the kind of like inspirational type song that you just don't really get. Maybe you get in some ways. Some artists will do like kind of inspirational songs, but they're like put together in a much more like pop type way. This is much more like down the middle. You just don't really get this exact kind of thing. I'm struggling to kind of frame this, but again, just because we spent the last 4 hours watching this movie, it does come across because you know who this guy and where he's coming from.
Yeah, and if nothing else, it brings you back to the '68 special. It uses the '68 special's closer as its closer. You know.
Yeah. It's yeah. Watching this did make me want to go back and watch that '68 special again because man,
Yeah, yeah,
is
absolutely. I would
it is
love to
such
just
good
pull that
stuff.
up and watch
That
it
stuff
because
rocks.
I have heard some of that music, but I've never seen that whole special. I'd
Yeah,
love to. And the clips they include in this movie are wild,
yeah,
so good.
yeah. So all right. Anything else before we talk about our thoughts about recommending it?
No, no,
We did a
let's
lot.
do it.
We had a lot to say about
We
this
did,
one.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. So if somebody's not particularly an Elvis fan, one way or the other, would you recommend this movie?
It's got to be yes because I'm not particularly an Elvis fan one way or another, and I loved this movie. And a little spoiler here, I think this might be. I said that I've always had this feeling in my life that eventually I would find some time to go deep on Elvis. It just hadn't happened yet. I think this movie might be the thing that makes it happen. I think I think if you talk to me in a year, I might have a lot of Elvis opinions because I've been listening to him a lot since we started watching this movie, and I have no intention of stopping.
So it wasn't Boz Lerman. It was
It was-
it was Thom Zimny and the
if so-
Elvis the Searcher
yeah,
and Tom Petty. It was really Tom Petty, I guess.
yeah, and Mike McCready.
It was mainly Mike McCready. Yeah,
I
guess
mean, the music in this movie is great. He deserves a lot of credit for it. You know,
yeah, like it seems like he could have a career as a guy doing
I mean,
scores for rock dogs.
some of the musical choices they include here when they're like trying to demonstrate that there was still good stuff even in the uninspired movies like the King Creole
Yeah.
and Bossa Nova.
Mhm.
Like both of those songs were awesome.
Yeah.
Absolutely riff, you know?
Yeah. I mean, the guy was so talented that he could take subpar material and when he was in the mood, just crush it.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, one thing the movie does that I didn't really have it. I guess I'm just gonna throw it in here. It because it didn't really. I didn't really have a place to talk about it. Was it does kind of the like high quality documentary thing of like having a lot of drone shots. I don't know. Whenever
Hmm.
there's
Hmm.
drone shots,
Hmm.
I'm always like, when do we need the drones? And I know like this because they made the choice in this movie not to show the people that are being interviewed. They had to like have something on the screen all the time, and there's only so
Yeah.
many like Ken Burnsy type, like recycling of Elvis still photographies you can do.
Still. Yeah. Yeah.
But there's also like a lot of shots of like an overhead drone shot of like a boy in Tennessee or wherever, like riding a bicycle. Like that was symbolic of like young Elvis like searching around.
Yeah.
There's things like that. There's like
Mhm.
like a 50 whatever Cadillac driving by. There's a lot of those kind of shots that like you know
Yeah, there's one shot I'm not especially crazy about, though it is slick and it does show like there's some money behind this thing. Um, the old footage of Elvis diving into the pool,
yeah
and then it smooth cut to like a photo of Elvis dissolving on the surface of the pool.
yeah. There's stuff like
It's like
that that
it's one of the first shots in the movie. Yeah.
yeah, there's a point where they're talking about the song Blue Moon of Kentucky and Springsteen is talking about it at length, and so there's like slowly zooming in for a long time on one picture of Elvis. There's a lot of that kind of stuff where it's like, all right,
Yeah.
I get it. Like you're making this movie, it's 3 hours long. You have a certain amount of film clips, and you've got the photos to work with, but you got to do something
Yeah.
to narrate this space. So I can't knock them that much for that. It's not necessarily my artistically favorite choice, but I get the role that it plays, and it puts you in that place. So yeah, I mean, I would recommend the movie too. I really liked it. I think if you're the type of person who's into music and you haven't really given Elvis a chance, this is a really good way in because it frames the music.
Hmm.
It clearly puts things into different eras, so you can be like, all right,
Hmm.
this seems like the kind
Hmm.
of thing I would be into, or this seems like
Hmm.
my I might want to check out this era. Okay, cool. Then you know what to look for. You want the gospel stuff, they tell you about that. You want the 50s stuff, they tell you about that. Um, so I think it does a lot of good for that. We certainly get a lot of our good buddy Tom Petty, which we love. And yeah, I mean it's super well made. You know what I mean? It has that
Hmm.
like professionalism where it just goes down easy. It is 3.5 hours long or whatever. So it's a lot. But I mean, there's no shortage of interesting stuff to talk about.
Breaking it into two parts works well.
Yeah.
It's because it goes down easier with an hour and a half at a time
It-
instead of
and it has
a
that natural
3 hour
break
sit.
when he goes in the army.
Does.
It kind of
Yeah.
all works.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
anyway, overall, well done. We recommend it. If you want to tell us your thoughts about it, we're talking about it over at Rock Docs Pod on Twitter. And anything else you got to say about Elvis? He was good. He's left the building.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, Rock Docs has left the building.